Hello. I want to talk a little bit about things I've seen in homework 7. This is the good books homework. Um, so just some comments for people so that you don't run into these mistakes when you're working on the final project, because I wouldn't want you to suffer for that. One thing I noted was for find by sequel. So this is pretty handy. For homework 7 and sometimes it's just simply handy. It's like we know how to talk to the database with SQL, so it's sometimes easier just to write up a query and do that. There are some downsides to it. Probably everything I've read would say it should really be your last resort to turn over to the SQL. And I think one of the big reasons they say that is you might want to move your app to another database. And you might have custom SQL that's only appropriate for your database, and thus it's not portable and you'll have to change those queries. It's not really going to be a problem for us because we're going to stick with Postgres the whole time. I think so what was the problem that I saw? It was this, and I apologize for not noting this. And as I went through it really quickly in a lecture, I just said, hey, you can do find by SQL here, da 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 da. It's like this. And so people did like this, except they joined multiple tables. So what you run into is if you join multiple tables and more than one table, has columns that match your model, because again, you're always doing something along the lines like book.find by SQL. And so you're putting in a query in here, and it's going to return a relation, as you know, a whole bunch of rows. And then that's going to be turned into book objects for you. Well, yeah, there's a dilemma there, in that if you have more than one table with the columns, and they have basically so somewhere in here you're going to have select blah 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 from books. So let's say so a lot of people did things like select star from books, comma, and let's say maybe there was an authors table or something, okay? And then they continue their statement. All right. So both books and authors have an ID column. So select star means we get two ID columns back. Yeah. Problem is you may not get the right values in the column. In the columns of the model that you're querying with. All right, so what happens here is we want book IDs. We want book objects with book IDs, okay? But both books and authors have an ID column. And it's entirely possible that Rails, when you run this, will stick the author ID in as a book ID and not the book ID. So on the one hand, that looks okay. You get back these results and you're like, yeah, I've got a book and its title and stuff. That's what I wanted. But you don't notice that the IDs are all wrong. The IDs go to like the author IDs, and those aren't the book IDs. So if you then try to use those books, you would have failures because those are not the correct IDs. So you don't want to do this. This is not what you want to do. When you have multiple columns, be sure that whatever you're doing here is you would go books.star. All right. This way you're assured that you only get the columns of the table, the end table that you want. Okay. There is actually, you can have additional columns be returned, but be very careful. And those would be those are what are read-only attributes of the objects. You need to be really careful though if you're going to have collisions in the column names, because Rails, this is one of the things that's maddening, is it doesn't say, it should throw an error really. It should tell you, I'm sorry, you've just done something and I don't know what to do. And instead it just throws one of them out. And if you're unlucky, it was the authors who got to be picked rather than the books. So beware of that sort of thing. Okay. Another thing that I saw on homework 7, and it's not an error. So this produced an error. Something though that I want you to keep in mind is that you should really try to use your database and active record. You know, the functionality in it. There were lots of people who wrote very complex Ruby to do what the database does. So instead of using the database to join data, they wrote complex loops to join data. This is absolutely one of those cases where understanding the capabilities of your database and the types of ways that you can query it to get it to do stuff and join data, eliminate data with values less than this, or select only the data with certain values and so forth. Use it to group by, compute averages, all sorts of things. The data, if you can just come up with the right, essentially, query or form the query with active record, you make the database do the work for you. Don't you spend your time. So all you have to do is be able to form that request, and then you'll get the answer back. And so people wrote tons of this complex code, and the more code that you write, the more likely you're going to make a mistake. And so I think a lot of errors got introduced in that regard. Just a heads up on assignments and things that tell you it says write a method of a certain name, you actually have to have it be the actual name. You can't change it from the word average to AVG. You know, the specification, the instructions say to name your method this, name your method that. If in doubt, copy and paste from the assignment into your code so that you don't mess that up. We're still seeing strange things where people are prompting from the console for input. And it's basically, it's like, it's a web server you're writing. It's going to be talked to with a web browser. What good does it do you to ask for input from the console? This is code that's running on a server. That's not, you should know that there's no reason to ever do that. Likewise, you know, people writing out in various methods, and they're using puts. And it's like, sure, in the dump.rb or the dumppretty.rb, it makes sense to have those puts there because we're going to run that on the server to actually just see some data. But for all of that model code, puts, where's it going to go? It's on the server. The user's never going to see it. Don't do that. I'm just going to read through some of these other things quickly. See some people, the instructions say to return an object, and they return just the ID. That's not the same thing as returning the object. An object is an object. There's still people, they actually have code that they never ran, and it has errors in it. So instead of like the word return, they use the word returns. All you need to do is run the code, and you would find out that you had mistyped stuff. So how do you fix that? You got to run it in the console to test it, or write yourself a script like you did with the DB. With the dump.rb or the dumppretty.rb, that then you can call stuff in Rails and test it out. But the biggest way is to run it in the console. And of course, when we're doing a complete web application, you could go and eventually run it in a browser and see yourself calling it. But before that, you can run it in the console to check things. And it's a huge win to be able to go into the console, make an object, and test out a method on it. I highly encourage that methodology. I'm seeing people return strings instead of an integer. So they return 3 instead of the integer 3. We don't want strings for, like, when I ask for return the number of ratings, I want an integer number. It's computer stuff. I don't want a string 3. What do I do with a string? And if you had questions, you should ask about those. And then also, some people actually had migrations. So they wrote a migration, but they must not have tested it, because when we run the migration, it fails and it comes up with an error and stuff. And the problem with that is then your Rails app is completely hosed. Usually it puts the database in a bad state and stuff, or potentially does. You don't want that. You want to get your migrations to actually work properly. It's better to have no migration than to have a broken migration, because when we start up and we test your web apps, we have to load all the data and stuff. And if it's broken, we can't really do anything more with your app, and that's a real problem. All right, so those are some things from homework 7. I wanted to let you know as you're working on your final project.